Hey, welcome to the Charting Life podcast. Here we're trying to figure out, I guess you could say, how do you live the good life by exploring the unexamined or overlooked parts of our lives, or maybe even the things that we take for granted sometimes. Today is a really interesting topic that I've been, wanting to talk about for a little while. And this is a topic of art and beauty and goodness and all these sorts of things that we very easily take for granted. We acknowledge something for a minute, we think it's great, but then we can easily move on. And so I have a perfect person to talk about this here today is Rick Sorenson. He's an artist and author, and I'm sure there's plenty of other things that you have as well that you kind of explain in a second. But this is something that I think is a very important topic for just really for anybody, but for Christians in the church especially. And so we're going to get into that here in a moment. So Rick, do you have anything that you want to share? Tell us about who you are. Kind of give us a an understanding of who you are.
Oh, sure. I grew up in church. My dad is a pastor, so I know everything that goes on in church from the time I was born, basically. And but God put love of creativity and art in me since I was a young boy. Even at age 6, I thought I would be an artist. At that age, you don't really know what you're going to be, but I always had that on my heart.
Yeah.
So everything's kind of stemmed from that.
Gotcha. So would you say that your maybe your Father's Day or Mother's Day art projects you did from Sunday school, were those a little bit better than the others, or was that on par?
No, I was average as far as a kid. It wasn't really till 7th grade that I began to really learn the skill of drawing.
Okay.
And I had a great teacher because, when you look back upon, your training, our class was taught as adults, not as kids, in how to perceive, how to draw from observation, which is kind of a Renaissance approach. And so we started with a white ball on a table, sitting on a white piece of paper with a lamp shining about a 45-degree angle on it, and turned all the lights out in the room. And then we learned how to draw that ball, to see the shadows on it, to basically learn what light does. So when we talk about light in the Bible, I see it from a very observational point of view, because I had to learn how to look at light.
Right.
And then see how, yeah.
Because a lot of times context makes a big deal for how we're understanding things like that.
Right. So yeah, light is, I guess, much more personal to me than to most people. Because when you spend hours looking at something and trying to see what that shadow does, how light wraps around it, how it bounces off, then you become involved.
Yeah, because I think context, it makes a big difference, and it's really interesting, especially when we're coming to scripture. I've got some friends who are homesteaders. They've got a good piece of property. They're growing plants and raising chickens and everything. So there's verses in the Bible that talks about planting seeds that really stand out to them, and that's just kind of what they hone in on and can be able to elaborate on a lot more. And so this is talking about light. I think that's a really interesting thing that I did not. I know when we're doing like digital stuff, like right now we're doing a video podcast recording, light definitely makes a difference. And like we were saying, I moved where I was going to record, and now I see in the camera the light's kind of hitting me a little weird right now. But again, that's just interesting. I think, again, your perspective that of how light works, even just from that simple example, it just fascinates me how that works. And especially when it comes to scripture, how deeply embedded so many aspects of scripture there is. You can dig as deep as you want to go on any particular asset or facet of God, and you can keep digging even after you found quite a bit. So so you said you were a pastor's kid. I guess I probably have to ask the question there, were you the one kind of running around all the time? Were you the what kind of PK were you? Were the one that made everyone kind of a little Well, anyways, if you know PKs, there's two categories typically how they fall. They're either really good or they're really not so good.
Right. I wasn't the rebellious kind.
Okay,
I was the good kind.
gotcha.
But I mean, I had a lot of energy as a kid.
Sure.
So I was a kid.
Yeah.
And you know, you get scars from being the kid
Hmm.
sometimes. So I received a few.
Yeah. Yeah. I know you talked
But
a bit about how in children, as we grow, there are certain age points where it's very unfortunate, especially like school today as well. Some of that, either you could maybe it's creativity or parts of your personality that are kind of forced to conform and get in line in a way that's probably um, more than harmful, to put it that way. It's certainly not. It does not always create flourishing. It creates
so
obedience, perhaps.
my parents were always encouraging
Hmm.
for me. In fact, when let's see, one of the things that shaped me as I look back on it, especially to pursue art, was something that my dad did with my sister and I. I'm the oldest, and I have a younger sister,
Hmm.
and so we went through Proverbs together. My dad would read Proverbs, and then my sister and I would have to start drawing it.
Okay.
And so, like in Proverbs 1, it talks about the characteristics of a wise man and characteristics of a foolish man.
Hmm.
And so my dad would draw a line down the middle of the paper, and on one side would say, now, what does a foolish man look like? Or what characteristic does the foolish man have? And what characteristic does the wise man have? You know, if I remember right, the basic thing that you can say is that the wise man listens and the foolish man doesn't
Hmm.
to God. And so um, my sister, who's 3 years younger than me, this we started doing this when I was 6 and she was 3.
Hmm.
So she drew like a round face that a kid would make at that age, and with ears for the wise man and no ears for the foolish man. So, and then as we progressed through Proverbs, then we would read the whole Proverbs and then pick out 2 verses to depict. And of course, how I depicted them and how she depicted them because of our ages were a little different, but it impacted. She she understood as much at age 3 of the conceptualization of the verse as I did at 6. And so, having gone through that, I think we did it a couple of times, and it was one of the shaping things of my life to become an artist. Because at that age, you start to learn how to bring ideas into a conceptual depiction.
Hmm.
And then when I got into junior high and I began to learn actually more of the craft and the skill of drawing in various ways, I already mentioned, how I started to draw. Then now you're bringing ideas that are in your head to be put out in a more coherent form.
Hmm.
And at that age, I'm not looking as much as how people are going to receive it. I'm looking at how I'm able to depict what I can to the skill level that I have, which at that time wasn't very much. And um, but the teacher that I had really was an excellent teacher in not treating us, as I said, as kids, but expecting us to be able to do this at an adult level. And
Right.
so there was no dumbing down of stuff. It was that we had to get this. And I mean, we did because we loved it.
Hmm.
And then that set up um, for me going to college. And then I went to art school eventually to further my skill level and education. But really, as I've looked back, that sitting down in Proverbs was one of the key things in shaping me.
That is, I love that. Because you're doing more than just listening, and I think this is probably true for anyone, but I would imagine, especially children, they're trying to visualize. They're going to be
Mm-hmm.
visualizing something, either what
Right.
it's what they're listening to or whatever else their mind may take them, and trying to center that onto something like drawing some depiction of what you're hearing. That is fantastic. That's brilliant. I don't know if that was something that was came up, your dad came up with, or if he heard somewhere. But regardless, I think for any parent who's wanting to think about doing it, that's really not a bad way to um, to
No,
go through the Bible that way.
over the years, talking to him about it,
Mm-hmm.
he just said it was just this idea that came to him.
Mm-hmm.
So the Holy Spirit just popped this idea into him.
Yeah, that's I was gonna end up getting that to that point where that I believe that is the Holy Spirit leading us. For my son, there's been a number of things where uh, we were just kind of at our wits' end, not really sure what we were going to do. And just this random idea popped in my head, like, well, let's just go for it. And what do you know? It's just something that starts working for him. And like, well, okay, thank you, Lord. It's like
Yeah.
I'm a little risky, a little, cautious at calling it the Holy Spirit until it starts working. I don't know if that's the best idea.
Yeah.
But the point is, it is great, that, God knows. I think that's great because God shows that he knows each of us individually. And
Yeah.
especially for parents, if we're willing to listen, uh,
Mm-hmm.
we can be able to pick up on how God's wanting um, to show his goodness and for us to teach our children. And I think another, especially, because for this podcast, I know not everyone who's listening is a Christian, so bear with us for a little bit, but especially from the Christian, standpoint, we realize that it's not just me and my wife are the parents of our child. Like, yes, we are, but we're partnering with God
Mm-hmm.
to also parent our child as well. And that's something can be a big, should be a big relief to anyone who finds themselves struggling with, which is, again, this isn't even where I plan on going with this, with this episode, this conversation so far. But if you ever find yourself where you're not really sure what's going on, you're at your wit's end, whether it's with your children or whatever, just realize there's the God of the universe who spoke the whole universe into existence, who
Mm-hmm.
created your soul, knows every number of hair on your head, all of that. And sometimes we just overlook his existence and we get
Mm-hmm.
really tied in trying to figure out our problems on our own. And he's just right there the whole time, ready to whisper to us whatever is needed.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any other comments on that that you want to add, or?
No, I think that summed it up pretty well.
Nice. Uh, so you have a few different things that I've heard you mention, and you also have in your book that kind of getting you to where you are regarding art, and up to where you got point in college as well. You talked about a trip that you traveled to. I think you said it was Japan at one point, where
Yes.
that really was a pivotal moment in your life, in your calling for art. Can you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. So my dad had this opportunity to go teach in a Bible college in Japan, in Hokkaido, the northernmost island,
Mm-hmm.
um, for Christ for the Nations Japan.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, when he told me that he and my mother were going to go to Japan, I'd say, "Oh, that sounds fun. I'd like to go." And he said, "Well, let's see." So, I ended up being able to go to Japan. And while there, then I was the videographer for my dad's classes. In fact, we found out they still use the videos to show my dad's classes on counseling and theology. And he did like, a dozen different classes. And then I was also the VIP person, or I was the person to take VIP people around the city.
Right.
And, then I taught conversational English in a couple of places. One was in the school, the other was in this church. I found out just because you speak English doesn't necessarily mean you can teach it well.
Right.
And, especially at that time, the Japanese students had English since at least the third grade.
Mm-hmm.
They knew all the rules but they just weren't confident in speaking. And so I had a couple Tesla books that I was able to obtain, and going through that and seeing what to do was always difficult. And there were several times as I'm walking over to the school, then I'm saying, God, I don't have anything. You got to give me something.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd have something by the time I got to the classroom. And that happened frequently. So during this time, there was an all-night prayer meeting going to go to. And I told my folks I didn't want to go to that. And so I didn't. After we got done with what we were doing that evening, then I got dropped off and they went on to the prayer meeting. So what I did was I went up to the apartment that we shared, and I had a night where I was drawing and praying. I would draw for half hour, 45 minutes, then I would get down on the rug and I would just start praying and asking God kind of about my future. You know, I was in my early 20s, and it was like, I kind of see, what life is like living out on my own, but what is my future? And so I would just be praying that with drawing, and then just this alternating drawing and praying. And I was still awake by the time my folks got home, just still in that mode. But during the time I was praying, then God asked me this question: did I want to be a Christian artist or an artist who's a Christian? And I didn't know the difference. And I had to figure that out. And I kind of sensed from that either one would have been okay for me to answer. I just had to choose which one it was that I wanted.
Right.
And so I won't go into the whole process I figured it out with.
Mm-hmm.
But the conclusion I came to was the difference had to do with audience. The audience for a Christian artist is narrow. It's Christians.
Mm-hmm.
The artist who's a Christian, their audience is the world. They're not limited to just this one group. They're able to influence whoever God brings across to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I told God I didn't want to be limited. I wanted to have influence wherever it takes me. So he said, okay, now you can go to school. Because before I went to 1 year of college after high school, because, that's what you're supposed to do.
Right, right.
And then in a nice way, God kicked me out of the house, and I ended up moving to Florida. And that's where I was starting to grow up, become an adult, not being a kid anymore. And I would ask God, can I go back to school like every 6 months or something? And he said, no, just learn what I have for you right now. And so when he told me that I could go back to school, this was after years of kind of saying, can I go back to school? No, not yet. You're not ready yet. So now I was ready to go back to school.
Man, that's interesting. Part of my journey it's interesting. There's some overlaps. My thoughts and attitudes were a little bit different. But first off, if you don't mind me asking, where did you go to in Florida during this time?
So I grew up in Idaho,
mm-hmm.
and I moved to Fort Lauderdale.
Fort Lauderdale. Okay. Yeah. I grew up in Kentucky, and I went to college for about 3 semesters. I was not prepared for it in the slightest. Also wasn't disciplined enough either. And it was so funny. I got to the point where I was done with it. And I've had people in my life, people who I respected and I looked up to, were saying like, you'll be back. You'll go back to education at some point. Like, yeah, I really don't. I don't think so. They're like, all right, that's fine, but you will. Like, okay, if God's telling you something, I'm not hearing it yet. And it was, let's see, from about 2008 to 2021 or 2009. Yeah, so about 12 years or so. until finally there was one day where I'm like, I think I could probably go back and get, go ahead and finish my degree and everything. And my wife's like, well, yeah, duh, absolutely, you should do this. So that was just kind of interesting. But I was also in Florida, the Tampa area, for a few
Okay.
years
Yeah.
during that waiting period where I was learning and growing and kind of
Hmm.
shaking out some of the things I just wasn't quite ready yet to dive on into that. So I just think that was kind of interesting. Some some overlaps there.
Yeah. I guess a lot of people move to Florida to grow up.
Yeah, I don't know how it was for you, but one of the things I learned there was almost nobody was born in Florida that lived in that area. One of the first three questions you ask when you meet someone is, hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
Right.
From here where I'm at, in Kentucky, it's what high school did you go to, or what do you do for a living? But there in Florida, it was almost always where did you grow up, or where were you born? Sorry, and it was probably I mean maybe one or two out of every 10 people that I knew was actually born in Florida. It was kind of special when you actually found somebody like that.
Yeah. Where I lived in Florida was a transplanted New York.
Oh, okay.
Um, I wasn't, South Florida is different than other parts of Florida.
Mhm.
And, Miami is international and Cuban, Caribbean, but Fort Lauderdale, which is only like what, half hour, 45 minutes above Miami,
Mhm.
is, um, just a transplanted New York. And then you go to Palm Beach, and that's where transplanted rich New Yorkers go. So I didn't live in the South, not at all.
Right. No, yeah. Yeah,
Well,
there's a thing we would say is that there's a certain part in Florida you go further and further south until you get north
yeah, that's
in Florida,
true.
about like
I,
that.
I, I think essentially the cutoff area is around Orlando. Go a
Probably,
little,
yeah.
you
That's
go a
kind of
little
where it
past
starts.
Orlando,
Mhm.
and then you're starting to not be in the South anymore.
Right.
And
Um,
and like you, when I was there, I was a youth leader. I
mhm.
was involved in evangelism explosion. I was just growing up.
Right. And getting a lot of life experience too, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's true too.
yeah. And so I want to, I think maybe put a pause at this point in your story. I want to come back to it in a little bit.
Hmm.
But we're talking about art. And again, it's one of those things we hear the word, we have an idea of what it is, but it's one of those things where I think if we were to try to define it, it's where we're probably going to get a lot of people are going to start getting different definitions. So why don't you give us your understanding, your definition of art, and then why so in your book, you're writing essentially that the church has lost art. So give us a definition, and then kind of work through what it is that what's taken place to this point in the church, why we lost art.
Um, as I've thought about a definition, I've kind of summarized it as art, and I mean this holistically in every
Mhm.
creative aspect that we do, whether it's music, whether it's visual, theater, um, every aspect. That art is an expression of our humanness. When you look at it more broadly like that, then you really see every creative expression now is an artistic expression.
Mhm.
And so um, I've come to really kind of think that that covers just about everything.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very broad category because usually when we're thinking of art, and I say weird, it's kind of my experience, but I think this is what a lot of people um, think.
You're thinking in visual art.
Yeah, visual art, specifically pictures or paintings, but
Right.
and then we might think of other type of visual arts like videos, but there's a lot more to art than just what it is that you see through that lens.
Right. And I like that broadness because it takes the what the the bias that we have,
Hmm.
it sidesteps that. So
Yeah.
we don't have to be touching on that
Hmm.
at too soon of a time.
Right. And what can you say one more time what that definition was? You said it was expressing.
So art is an expression of our humanness.
Right. Okay. So when you hear
And I
things,
mean
right.
what I mean humanness instead of humanity, because I think it's so ingrained into us
Hmm.
that it's not just an expression of humanity, it's our humanness.
Hmm. Yeah, and well, and especially coming from Christians, where part of that humanness is being made into the image and likeness of God, and so we are reflecting that. And
Exactly.
and when you have that kind of definition, that really does take out the idea of, well, I can't be an artist because of blank.
Hmm.
Whether it's your
Exactly.
inability to draw the lines appropriately, you never color inside the lines, you're not creative enough.
Exactly.
Yeah,
That's really why I went for that broader um, understanding.
yeah, and and I've if we are made in God's image, then I would say that we're all artistic and we're all creative because that's how God is. I
Yes.
know you've talked about this. How that's how what is it? That was God's first way that He revealed Himself. Did I get that right?
So, in Genesis 1:1, as you said, the first way God revealed himself is as creator. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that's the first way he revealed himself to us. And then, as you also touched on, that he made us in his image. So, like the next chapter, he says, let us make man in our own image, male and female. And so, part of that image is that we are also creators. And we have to create because that's what God put into us. That's
Mhm.
why I brought it down to our humanness. It's so ingrained into us because part of that image that God put into us is to be a creator.
Right.
And so we have to create. We have to.
Mhm.
And if you think about it, everything that we see around us first started in someone's imagination and was
Mhm.
brought into reality. Everything you see, from the time of Adam to now, everything started in someone's imagination and then got worked out.
Yeah. I mean, just real quickly, the computers we're using to talk through, or whatever device someone's
Right.
using to listen, or I see the fan in your room, or the books and stuff that
Yeah.
I've got around here. These things are not, they never existed until they were
No,
brought forth from something that was just an imagination.
exactly.
Somebody living the way that God created us to do this. So it seems like the question is not whether we will create something, but what we will create. And
I
is
think
it
it does
something
come down to that.
Yeah, and is it something that brings life or does it bring death? And I think ultimately, uh, I call it the neutral myth or the myth of neutral. That neutral doesn't exist.
Right.
If you like to use car, wordage or analogies, if you're in neutral, you're eventually going to stop. So it's
Right.
like it's just a slow. You're stopping at a much slower pace. So
Yeah,
like there's
true.
no, you're not. There's not a whole lot of creating in the middle of not good or bad. Now,
Hmm.
what I do like about art, especially as you were talking about being I think I'm saying this right, an artist who is a Christian,
Yes.
that you're creating things, and in doing so, what depending on your mode of art that you're working with, sometimes you are dealing with things that are not so great. From the writing and the author styles, something is interesting. I used to work at the Family Christian bookstore.
Hmm.
They were popular for quite a while, but there was
Yeah.
a very specific niche of things that was there. It was all Christian artists or authors or whatever it was. There
Right.
was very few things outside of that. And so there was a few authors that were a little more on the, I don't I'm not sure what better word to use other than edgy. That they
Right.
wrote things, they tried writing within the confines of Christian art, but they
Hmm.
tried writing real things. But if
Right.
somebody ever came in and looked for that one novel about the axe murderer and the prostitute, I'm like, what are you talking about? But Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is so deeply Christian and such, I mean,
Right.
it is such a just deep revelation of the human soul. If anyone's never read it, please go read it. But but
Hmm.
if you have, you'd understand that like the idea of the main character was, I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but he did commit a murder and he justified it in his mind. But the idea of your soul that was absolutely wrecked with guilt, even though you knew you had no, you were completely justified. That's the very short version that that I would give for that. But
Right.
again, nobody would come in looking for Crime and Punishment, but that was just as Christian, and I would even say more real and more honest than 90% of the stuff that we carried in the store.
Oh,
Uh,
sure.
but
Right.
so, yeah, go ahead.
No, I agree. The um, yeah, I often have a hard time going into a Christian bookstore. Um, if I'm looking for visual art, then
Hmm.
I'm not seeing art.
Hmm.
And that's not where I go to look
Right.
for art. And, it's, for me as an artist, that's frustrating.
Hmm.
And there were times that I had to like forgive everybody for not giving anything of excellence.
Hmm.
That or the few things that are excellent would be many of the books, but not all of them.
Right.
And so it's um, and you could say the same about music
Hmm.
as well.
Yeah.
So the whole thing um, of excellence has always been, that's why I have spent years to hone my craft, and then in learning how to write,
Hmm.
then that is also a long journey
Right.
because I didn't start out as a writer. It's, you know, sad for me, I had an American education, so that didn't help me.
Right. No, I understand. I've been I guess maybe working out that muscle of writing, if you want to put it that way.
True.
And that's something that before I ended up going back to school at seminary, I thought, yeah, I'm just not a writer. It's too difficult it's just it's just not something I feel like I could do. But I had like creative enough in terms of stories, but I
Right.
just didn't think that's something I could ever really get to doing. And then through practice, through force of practice, at some point, I realized,
Mm-hmm.
okay, there's actually something to this. It's still very taxing on my mind to do so, but what I am coming up with are things that I can actually enjoy and say, I'm proud of this, whether it's a paper that I'm writing or something else I'm working on. Say, look, I'm actually happy with what this came out to be. But
So I'll give you real quick what freed me to write.
mhm,
Since we're talking about writing for a minute,
mhm,
I was taking this. So when I went to art school, I took this class on Introduction to Museum Work
mhm,
in Salem, Massachusetts. And it was at this historical um, museum. And the teacher of this class was the editor for this historical magazine that all these historians would send articles to, so it could be published
mhm.
in here. And I mean, it was a prestigious thing. And I remember her saying to us one time that so all these historians sending, who have PhDs, they can't write.
Mm.
And she has to basically rewrite their articles to make it readable. And I said to myself, I can write as bad as the guy that has a PhD.
Right.
And that freed me for later on when I was writing. I could write that bad. And then as I so, um, started to write, then over time, you know, I, the whole approach that I would take would be, is what I'm saying clear? If it's
Right.
not clear, then I have to keep doing it until it's clear.
Hmm.
And so that took me over 20 years to do, to get something halfway clear.
Yeah.
But that's what freed me to write, because I can certainly write as bad as the guy that has a PhD.
Yeah, I've had some thoughts on other topics of that. It's like, well, if I'm seeing somebody be successful at not doing great, maybe that gives me
Yeah.
some freedom, some peace to try that out myself. Uh, well, I want to ask maybe a few questions, and then I absolutely want to get into how this works in with the church. But having your I guess your expertise and your education and all your experience in art, do you have a period in history that you prefer? Because it seems like you do a lot on the visual arts, whether I know you mentioned drawing a few times. I don't know if you've gone into things beyond drawing or sketching, painting, whatever that is, but do you have a period that you like better than others of some of the historical side?
Um, before I tell you that, I'll answer this other question you just asked, is kind of what mediums
Hmm.
am I familiar with? And so drawing and painting, um, clay, pottery, that's what I had in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
We were taught relief printmaking at that time too, and so I'm familiar with all forms of printmaking. I don't necessarily do them all, but I'm familiar with all the different approaches, from carving on wood all the way through digital. There's I'm familiar with Chinese painting, which I love. Chinese ink paintings. I just love looking at them. So that would be one of the ones I would always be gravitating to. And so I'm familiar with 3D design and sculpture, some film stuff. So I can look at things in sequential stuff and know if it's logical or not.
Nice.
Art school gives you a lot of different things to learn.
Yeah.
Whether you're learning them personally or you're seeing some other student learning it and you guys are talking about it. So most forms of visual art I'm fairly familiar with.
Nice.
And then over the years in preparation for writing my book, I've been working on a manuscript, and I kind of like a textbook. And so in doing so, then I've researched into music, dance, drama, any other area I'm forgetting off the top of my head, in history and in their theory, just seeing how they approach it. So I have a good foundation for every creative endeavor.
That's awesome.
And so because of my background as a visual artist, I'll always kind of be looking more at the visual than at the others. But but I mean, we're all exposed to different things growing up with music, with movies. We've all seen movies from the time we're born. And so we all have this understanding of what a movie is. And we know intuitively, because we got everything through osmosis this way, if a movie is going to be good or bad. We all kind of know it. And similarly with music. And more training we get, like if we're taking music lessons, then we have a little deeper understanding. But we all have this kind of intuitive grasp of things because we've been experiencing it from the time we're born.
Yeah.
The visual arts throw people off for a variety of reasons. Mainly because we're not inundated with it from the time we're born. So I don't have like a single artist that I prefer. I appreciate art in every time period.
Yeah.
And as I've researched other cultures, then I try to incorporate some of that too. But yeah, I really have a soft spot for Chinese painting.
That's really neat. So you made a claim that I think is very interesting. Just pivoting a bit back to the idea of art in the church, and that the church has lost, I guess, its sense of art. And when I'm thinking about, throughout history, we've had people like Michelangelo and there's for whatever reason a couple of names are dropping out. I've had some of the popular ones, but we've had everything from was it the frescoes and the like the mosaics, and we had the paintings on the walls and the catacombs and all sorts of stuff throughout history. Sometimes they're very relatively crude or simple, like the ichthus fish, and to things that are much more detailed, like the Sistine Chapel.
Right.
So at what point did the church start to lose art, or did it change? did its emphasis or focus change at some point? So I guess I guess what I'm getting at is how do we get from where we were doing the church was doing art had art done really well to today?
Mhm.
Like where did the it fall off?
Well, in many ways, you can think of the Reformation
Mm-hmm.
as as the beginning point of that. Um, so, as you were saying during the Renaissance, um, and even before, visual art was being incorporated into churches, often as a form, especially in the Middle Ages, of helping the illiterate um, population congregation
Mm-hmm.
to be to better understand the stories of the Bible that were being related. And so those would be depicted in sculpture, in stained glass windows, um, in paintings as ways to help the congregants. And so things like that grew so that by the time of the Renaissance, that um, the skill level was just, superb.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as you mentioned, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, you can't help but think of them as like almost a pinnacle.
Right.
And so they were looking at um, how you depict these stories in not only fresh ways, but real ways. That's part
Mm-hmm.
of what was going on in the Renaissance, is bringing more reality in, into what was being presented. And so that really was amazing for its time. And then by the Reformation, which was only what, like another 50 years or so after,
Something like
basically,
that. Yeah.
uh, say at the end of Leonardo da Vinci's life or Michelangelo's life, the uh, Reformation would have been starting,
Mm-hmm.
or it had already started. And so there began to be this gradual separation of having images to be put in churches, especially Protestant churches.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it didn't happen immediately, but the whole idea of imagery began to be thought of in different ways. And you didn't want to bring in the wrong imagery. So that began to get lessened. Now you come to the Puritans' time, and that really, of course, the reaction against the Catholic and the icons of the Catholic
Mm-hmm.
being brought in, you don't want that idolatry brought in. So that was something that the Protestants, especially as they came further west from Europe into the Americas, began to not incorporate. And so now we come to our time period. And so most churches don't have anything in it. And the idea of church itself was changing from the Renaissance. At, at the time of the Renaissance and before, church was considered the building. That's what
Mm-hmm.
church is, which was different than it was in the beginning, which the church being the people, that we are the
Right.
church. And so it changed to the building. And then in our period, it really went from the building to the meeting. Church
Mm-hmm.
is the meeting. It's not. So in that way, it's the pearl. The meeting is the pearl, and the outside is ugly, like a shell.
Yeah, that's that's interesting. So, and to make sure I've got this, what you said, make sure I understood that. The last bit you were saying was, our conceptual, what we thought, what we saw of the church was it was originally seen as the people of God. To it got to the point where the building was the significant piece, and then we've gone to it's our meeting time, which is
Right.
still kind of thinking in that framework of the building, which is
Right.
still, we're still borrowing from that framework. And it seems that throughout, for about 14, 1500 years or so of history within the church, there has been a good use of art, but
Yes.
there's been some wayward strands, you could say, here and there, where
Hmm.
there's a, to my Catholic friends, they understand you where there's icons and that sort of things, but there's also a degree where some of that can definitely go overboard, just to put it to
Sure.
put it nicely.
Sure.
There's always a risk, if nothing else, but there's definitely always a risk there.
But if the church is the building, then we
Mhm.
got to make sure that it's beautiful.
Exactly. Yeah. And that
Eh,
actually leads me to an interesting point, something that I've wanted to maybe explore a bit more whenever I have the time and the ability to actually put my resources to focus on it. But there's I guess this idea that you can start to tell what's important to the church by walking in the building and seeing what is the um, where things are laid out, where's the focus of things. So, for
mhm.
example, if you go into a Catholic church, the
Right.
table or the communion in the Eucharist, that's going to be
Mhm.
front and center. That's going to be the thing that's ornamented.
Right.
That you could tell what their importance is. In a lot of Protestant churches, especially, if you're looking in things like the Reformed camps, like the pulpit is going to be the thing front and center.
Mhm.
That's the beautiful thing.
Right.
It might even be a little bit more elaborate because this is where we're preaching from the word in that degree.
Mhm. Yeah.
You'll have some churches, Pentecostals especially, like there's a big, wide open room for the altar where it's like that is where there's this experience, and so it's just really interesting. And I remember my church growing up, there was going through this thought caused me to remember where we had a lot of things kind of like almost in a row. When you walked in, um, there was the table for the most part, usually kind of in front in the altar area, and above it was the nice pulpit. To the sides, you had the nice, I say nice, it was a big open spot with the altar and the place where you actually would kneel down at the altar up there as well. And then right
Mhm.
above all of it is you have the baptismal, and there's a picture up there that's it was Jesus's baptism.
Right.
And so it was just really interesting that as you're going in, your eyes are directed in a particular direction, and you see
Mhm.
all of these things that are very important to us set in one piece. And I think it's interesting. There again, it depends on your particular church tradition that someone might find themselves in when they walk. It just walk into church the next time you go there and just see where are your eyes drawn to.
Mhm.
Just as an outsider walking in, what is the focal point? And I think a lot of churches today, it's going to be less of the pulpit and more of the stage. And I'm not,
Right.
that can be taken well, and it can be taken poorly too. I think a lot of times
Sure.
might have to do, the stage is probably more of this is where we're coming for musical worship, where there might be singing, there might be dancing, there might be
Well,
lights or stuff, but
well, I'd say a stage is a reflection of the meeting.
mhm,
And so you got to have the best meeting be the best you can make it.
right.
So you get um, as upbeat of music as you can get to really get people up for the
Mhm,
so that they will pay attention to the message being
mhm,
done.
yeah.
And so it, now there's more incorporation of the arts into um, contemporary meetings,
Mhm,
but it's still about the meeting.
right. And so, do you think that's probably a good place where we're at this point, where the meeting is the emphasis, or do you think that's something that has been? Do you think that's not quite as it should be? So, do you think that's ideal or closer to ideal than it has been in the past?
That's a good question. I'd say um, it doesn't have to be bad,
Hmm.
but has it become entertainment, which is changing the focus of
Hmm.
what it should be.
Right.
And if it's gone to entertainment, that means that we have lost focus.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there would be a variety of reasons we could, if we explored that, that would come out. But um, somewhat, I think it would depend on the tradition, as you're saying. But it seems like from some of what I've seen in the big churches that
Hmm.
it's often more about the entertainment aspect.
Right. So it's interesting that, I mean, it might even be just an interesting part of the human aspect that we have, or even the humanness, where we do tend to fall off at some point when our eyes do go off of God, where the
Yeah.
art and, again, with all due respect to my Catholic friends or those who are in the Orthodox Church as well, some of the images and the icons go beyond just honoring
Hmm.
to a sense of worship, or again, to
Right.
say at the very least, I think this part where anyone can agree is there's definitely a potential and a risk to do that. Just as
Sure.
for us in Protestant churches as well, if one of the emphasis is the stage, for example, we risk running it into entertainment. It's not that it can never be have a form of. It's not that it can never be enjoyable,
Right.
but there is definitely a risk where that, like, it's good to know in whatever your tradition, whatever your denomination, or whatever word you're going to use to reference that. It's good to know where the boundary lines are of this is going too far in one direction, and I think that's really helpful if we can start to gather that. And so certain traditions are going to have certain things that it is much more easily to go overboard and to start worshiping um, something else but God.
I think the difference is not that we're not going to be emotional or
Mm-hmm.
have an emotional response, but it's we have an emotional response because of something, not just for the response.
Right.
So, like when we sing "Great is the Lord," that
Mm-hmm.
was just the first hymn that came to my mind.
Mm-hmm.
That is a powerful hymn, and we can't help when we sing it, but have this um, joyous, positive response as we sing. How um, I, I, let's see. What did I say? Great is the Lord?
Yeah.
I meant how great thou art.
Okay, I was wondering if that's where you're going, because I couldn't quite remember think of the Praise Lord, but How Great Thou Art,
Yeah.
absolutely beautiful song. Yeah,
So yeah, I'm glad I caught that because that changes the example.
yeah. I know people are going to try to start googling the hymn that may not
Yeah.
exist.
Oh, that'd be funny though. But how great thou art is so powerful,
Mm-hmm.
and our emotional response to it is because of what's already there.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, So in that way, the response is a second. It's not first.
Mm-hmm.
In entertainment, the response will be kind of a first thing, not a, because of.
Yeah.
And I think that would be an easy way to see where does the emotion come from.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good way, I guess, to test. Are is it like an entertainment focused thing, or is there just a natural response to emotional response to what's going on? Because I
Yeah.
know that as a lot of people, just depending on how you grew up, some people are very cautious about having emotions in church at all. But
Hmm.
the thing is, God created us as emotional beings. We're
Right.
rational creatures. We're emotional beings. We're creative, and you know, I mean, when Jesus, let me put it this way: when when Christ came to redeem us, He came to redeem all of us.
Yes.
Our emotions as well, and so I think they're outside of special times or moments, generally speaking, painting with a broad brush, is emotions should absolutely be a factor, but we do have to be
Hmm.
careful not to be led away by emotions. Uh,
Right.
I usually think of it maybe in these terms, going back to the idea of a painting. You have a wonderful work of art, and usually there's a frame associated with it as well. Well, the rationality and the limits of what is true, it provides the frame, and it should also have an air
Hmm.
of beauty to it as well. It should complement the
Sure.
painting, but the painting is where that emotional depth is. But
Right.
the frame gives you a border from where you are safe to have the full expression of those emotions, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And if we get that reversed, we can easily run away. And I've seen so many times people say something like, well, God told me this. To
Hmm.
which I would ask, okay, well, how do you know? It's like, I just know it in my heart. Like, okay, how did God tell you this? Like, okay,
Yeah,
fine. You ask a couple of questions like, can we
right.
get, and like, well, no, I just felt that way. Like, okay, that feeling is real. It's, I'm glad you recognize that, but maybe we can need to make sure it's in its right place. But in
Hmm.
a good working order, and let's see if you agree with this, but when things are working well, we have the rational faculties and we have the emotions working
True.
in harmony with one another.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah.
It's not just the feeling,
Mhm.
but the truth has to be there as well.
Yeah. And so, how would you say? You noted that how we've gotten off, the church has gotten off on art, whether it was misused, and then with the Reformation, and how there was this, we're going to almost reactionary. We're going to distance ourselves from it.
Hmm.
I think you mentioned the Puritans, for example. It's if you think of Puritans, the most decorative thing you're going to have is a plain wooden cross, maybe.
Right.
But and there were plenty of things that kind of grew up around that, and a lot of things I think were reactionary to the Reformation, the Catholic Church at the time, and that
Right.
sort of thing, and less of we're trying to get what it. We're trying to make the actual Reformation itself. We're trying to reform it appropriately.
Hmm.
It's just there was a lot of reaction, and there's definitely a lot of damage that came from that, I believe. But in today's situation, I know when we say art, there's a very wide range, which we've already covered. But how would you say the church can start to reclaim? I know you've addressed this in your book as well, but just kind of briefly, how would you say the church can reclaim art appropriately?
Um, I guess first to see that being creative is from God.
Mhm.
And so um, that's something that most Christians don't really see. That, we talked about this at the beginning, that God put creativity into us. And
Mhm.
so being able to see that that is good and now incorporating that in what you do. So there's a lot of things that are being done today um, that are positive. There's churches that have different art programs going on. Some of them will help teach people various skills of like painting, whether watercolor or um, just various mediums and
Mhm.
how to use them. Of course, music has been done and taught in churches, for a long time.
Yeah, that seems to be the big one that is our big emphasis today is music.
And that is true. That's what we normally think of as the acceptable form of creative output or creative worship. Um, so, some churches that are incorporating art, they'll have exhibitions for either the church members or they might have some gallery that is open to the public to come in that
Mhm.
they try to incorporate into the cultural um, goings on of their community. And so the two emphasis or the is either evangelism for that type or it's about worship for the other.
Mhm.
And um, one of the things I've noticed is there's a mixture of amateur and professional that will be used. And I think that's good and appropriate, but that's where it stays at. It doesn't go beyond. Um, to incorporate everybody to show something that will encourage the the ones that are beginning or the amateurs to keep going. But the pursuit of excellence beyond that has to be more refined.
Mhm.
And that's where I think most of churches fall short is they're not looking at refining works to in the same way that a professional will want
Mhm.
to refine it so that the idea is presented as clearly to their audience as they can do.
Yeah.
And I mean that in this broadest sense because you can have a lot of ambiguity into your work, but
Hmm.
there's always this um, balance between clarity and guiding the audience through the work between the ambiguity. So amateurs don't understand that. They think that they're just putting down what they're putting down.
Hmm.
They're not looking at the way that you intentionally guide your viewer, your audience through the work, because that's more intentionality, but it's also part of the meaning in how you guide them.
Hmm.
So um, that's where I see the weakness is for right now,
Yeah.
is that they haven't pushed past like a cliche.
Right. Yeah. I think there's, for anybody in general, going from either maybe you have a particular talent or skill, but honing that in into making it excellent, that's a difficult thing as it is. And a lot of people don't want to
Mm-hmm.
put in that work. But
That
something
is true.
as that, this is, we're even encouraged through scripture to
Mm-hmm.
do everything as if we're doing it to the Lord.
Right.
We should put excellence into everything we can. Now, you may not be excellent at everything, but you can put the excellence that you have and then hone your training and your craft.
Sure.
And I do think it's very unfortunate that a lot of the arts in general, the church has walked away from. And
Mm-hmm.
there's been, and again, this next bit is going to be a little bit depending on your particular, um, you know, tradition or denomination within Christianity, but a lot of the academic fields too has just been left abandoned by the church.
Oh yeah.
There are plenty of churches who I've heard of that um, either I've heard it myself directly or I've seen I've talked to people and they've had this experience where uh, there's a pastor of a church. He went off and, well, I say went off. So he was pastoring the church and he took seminary classes just on his own, didn't make any fuss about it or anything. And then
Mm-hmm.
when he found out when he was graduating, the church got very upset that he had went to seminary at all. And I was like, well,
Yeah.
that's interesting. But then in their mind is you go off to get seminary and then you're learning all this stuff about God, but you're not actually, these are just
Mm-hmm.
details, but you've actually lost your way in some way. And
Yeah.
and it is an observation that kind of thing does happen,
Mm-hmm.
but that shouldn't be the normal. And
No.
I think, so as far as excellence and honing your craft, um, I think because we have, I say again, we very generally within the church, we've not put a big emphasis. We may not have a expert in most churches of somebody who is an artist and whatever that the particular craft may be. So we might
Yeah.
have to say, go and get your training, whether an apprenticeship or school, whatever the process looks like for your craft. You might need to go, and you're probably going to have to go outside of the church to do that. But
Right.
also, if you are solid in your faith, that
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't be a problem.
Right.
And that again, that works with academics as well. But as you were talking in this last little bit, it just reminded me that the arts in general, it's not just that the church has abandoned or left art to the side. Because I mean, sometimes we do create not so great art. Again, the Christian artists,
Mm-hmm.
it is a cliche for a reason. Unfortunately, there were plenty of great
Yeah.
musicians. So I grew up in the '90s,
Right.
and there were plenty of good Christian. But there
Mm-hmm.
was a couple of really good Christian bands and plenty of okay ones. But
Right.
um, but whatever the art form is, it just so all right. Let me back up a little bit. It's not that as church we've not done art, but the arts as a category,
Mm-hmm.
we have left that, and people who are artistic and creative, there's a wide gap. Yeah, I could
Mm-hmm.
even say missionally for that.
Right.
That so like in my area, there are some schools that I know, like high schools, where like that is the arts high school. Like almost everything that they do is some sort of arts.
Sure.
And Christians, especially when I say Orthodox, I mean just like orthodoxy, correct, basic Christian theology.
Mm-hmm.
Among them, there are very few. There's
Yeah.
plenty of other, beliefs and styles that come in there, but it's not Christianity.
Right.
And I think a lot of that is because we have left it behind. So it's not like, yes, we need the art for the beauty and to say something about the goodness of God, but there's also the people who are going to gravitate to certain crafts of art because that's just how God has designed them and called them. But we're also leaving them to the wayside by and large. Does that kind of on part of what you're thinking? Would you correct that at all, or is that I think that's spot on?
Well, I think what you're saying is true. I think you have to remember that we have an enemy,
Mm-hmm.
and that he has geared all of society to discount creativity. All you have to do is watch the movie Sister Act 2
Mm-hmm.
to kind of remember that. In the movie, the mother was afraid that the girl who sings super well would follow after her father and not
Mm-hmm.
be successful. So her protection was really fear, just in the form of protection, but she was fearful about that. But in the movie, the girl's talent was so great that it had to come out.
Mm-hmm.
She had to defy her mother. And then, of course, at the end of the movie, the mother said, "Oh, I was so wrong because you were great." So, so school is one of the ways that discounts creativity. School is about conformity.
Mm-hmm.
The art schools that you're talking about for high school kids, they're a little bit different in that they're trying to promote creativity. But almost every other school is taking creativity out of kids, saying there's only one right answer. That's all testing is about, is
Mm-hmm.
teaching them that there's one right answer and you got to conform. And so by the time they graduate high school, most will say that I'm not creative because it's been beaten out of them. And then there's a biological transition that happens between about 8 to 10, when a child's brain is transitioning from subjective thinking to abstract thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so that transition point is often observed through drawing. And kids will want to look outside themselves now to the world around them. They want to depict what they see, whether that's some knickknack on the shelf, or it was a magazine
Mm-hmm.
thing. I don't know what it would be so much anymore. Maybe they open up the computer and draw something off the internet that captures
Right.
them.
Yeah.
But they want to depict what they see in it to look like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if they can't, then frustration grows because they can't do it. They know they can't do it because what they have attempted to do doesn't match with what they're looking at. And so it may take them a couple of years to reach a saturation point where they give up, say, I can't do it. I hate it. I can't do it. And the enemy during this time is speaking that you're right, you can't do it. Everyone else can do it, but not you. You're not creative. You can't do it. So we have an enemy that has set up systems to block creativity in us and is helping to destroy it in ourselves, or make us believe that we can't do it, that we cannot connect to this image of God that he put into us. So it's not just ourselves or the situations, but we have we have these things we have to actively confront. So how we do that is we have to embrace this image that God put into us, whether we believe it or not. It's a revelation that God put creativity into you for some people. And I remember first adult I taught drawing to was a friend. She was elderly, well, at least compared to me at that time. And I wasn't charging her anything. She's a friend. And so I was teaching her how to draw. And I was only going to do this like 6 or 8 week course, one time a week for like an hour and a half.
Hmm.
So, nothing very long. And it took over 6 months to go through this because she was confronting things that kept coming up in her of all these fears, got sick, and I wouldn't let her stop. She said, "Oh, I got to stop. No, I'm not going to let you," because I saw that if I did, that it would only reinforce that lie that she believed.
Yeah.
And so by the time she got done with this, the 6 weeks class, after a good 6 months or so, then she was able to break through that lie.
Yeah.
And so, but sometimes it goes pretty deep and you really have to work at it.
Hmm. Yeah, that's where, then there was art therapy is a thing. I don't know a whole lot about it, but it's, but it seems like that, like that sort of thing. Is that, do you think that's somewhat common where people start working through art and then they have to confront those lies that they've believed? And then,
Some the different classes. So I've taught over the years um, different drawing classes in churches, the creativity class, and the most extreme example that I ever saw of someone was so in this class, I kind of start people out doing what I first learned to do, drawing a ball on the table
mhm,
with one light source on it. And I do a quick demonstration so that they kind of understand the approach, and then um, I turn it loose. I don't do a complete drawing because really you have to start discovering things yourself, and you won't
right,
really discover that just by watching me. And so there was this woman who was fearful coming in, and you know for some people drawing especially is very scary
mhm,
because they've believed the lie for so long that they can't do it. And during the class, her eyesight started to grow dim. Get By the end of the class, she couldn't see. She was having to be helped by her husband to the car. And then when she decided after that she was going to quit the class, her eyesight came back immediately.
wow,
So um, that's the most extreme I've ever seen. But those are the type of things that you'll experience with adults. Maybe not to that degree, but it could.
right. Yeah, it does seem like there's a lot of resistance, and it's not as much as it is about lines on a paper or your ability to draw a picture, as much as it is
Yeah.
a lot of it's being vulnerable and being honest,
Right. Yeah.
and whether it's a lie that you've been telling or you've been believing for so long, um,
Hmm.
man, it really doesn't want to let go. And of
No.
course, there can be some serious, degree of that, where again, the lady to the point where she wasn't able to see well if she was going to continue. At least that was that response, the response that she had to that. But, uh, but again, from scripture, we see that, Jesus or the God is light. And if we are in the light, then there is no darkness.
Right.
And lies like to stay in the dark if they can.
Exactly. Right.
And I don't just necessarily mean, hey, you're lying to somebody in your life, which it very well could be part of the case. But I think there definitely is a view of the image and who we are. Identity is talked a lot today, but ultimately, if our identity is outside of Jesus,
Hmm.
then like something is going to be at that top seat of
Right.
identity in life. And if it's not Jesus, what in the world is it going to be? Um,
Right.
and that is there's not a lot of great options to choose from. To again, just to put that a little bit tongue in cheek and very simply, basically, if Jesus as the light is not in the top seat of identity in your life,
Mhm.
then your options are not good of what's going to be there. And
Yeah.
a lot of times we like to make Jesus play second fiddle, but
Hmm.
that's not where he wants to be.
Right.
Um, we've been going for a while. This is a great conversation, by the way. Thank you so much. There's I think another thought or two I want to throw out there, and then we'll try to go into what I find is pretty fun and very interesting, kind of some final rapidish fire questions. But and I think this goes back to your comments again from about being an artist who is a Christian
Hmm.
and who your audience is. I was working on a paper a little while ago, and I just used as a kind of a case study Johann Sebastian Bach
Hmm.
as a musician, and
Right.
his is very interesting because he would write like the letters SDG and the margins of his composition notes for Sola Deo Gloria, for the to the glory of
Yeah.
God. Or there's a
Right.
couple of things he would mark, but basically he's attributing his music to God.
Oh
But
yes,
they are
he
not
wrote it.
right, but he's not writing Amazing Grace either. you know,
No,
it
but
yeah,
it was to be sung in churches,
yeah.
or
Mhm. But
so.
what was really interesting is when you fast forward, how long was it? About 100 years or so, when we're starting to get into 1900s
Mhm.
Soviet area. They
Right.
were very critical of everything that was religious of any kind,
Right.
especially Christian. But Bach was one of the musics that they were allowed to play and to listen to,
Yes.
but yet it was deeply, deeply Christian without
Right.
just being, again, like you said, a lot of it was sung in church, but or played and that sort of thing. But it was just really interesting that like that was a really
Mhm.
interesting. Again, I'm using the word interesting too much, but as a case study for when we're creating something, and especially art, it doesn't have to just be a depiction of a Bible scene. It doesn't just
No.
have to be rewriting
Hmm.
"How Great Thou Art" or "Amazing Grace." Create beauty for its own sake, which
That's true.
and I think it was this is actually reminded me of a point I wanted to bring up. But I know you've mentioned Francis Schaeffer quite a bit, and he mentioned something along the lines of that art doesn't have to be a tract. Like we don't have to come up with a cool picture to be a gospel tract. And hey, have you heard about Jesus? But
Yeah.
it can be a doxology within itself. Uh,
Right.
do you have any thoughts on that quote, or would you make any addition or thoughts to that?
Um, well, I think that's true. Um, I'd like to comment first before I go into that
Sure.
about Bach,
Mhm.
because he's such a fascinating figure.
Mhm.
But one of the things about Bach was his excellence was so great that everybody, recognizes it.
Mhm.
But even more than that, his influence changed music to develop into what we now call today modern music.
Oh, really?
If it wasn't for him, our music would be vastly different. And even today, there are classical musicians, well, even rock musicians, that go and are influenced still by his work
Wow.
and still studied by him. Or I mean, they study his work
Mhm.
and saying, no, he's just so great. If only we could be even close to that.
Right.
So, with him being a Christian and having that type of influence, he's just one person. Now, if we were all like that,
Yeah.
what would happen? But that's the pursuit of excellence. And,
Mhm.
as you said before, he's doing it to God. So, it's not only just doing church music, but he's doing this to God. So, it has to be great.
Right.
So, now getting back to the Francis Schaeffer quote, he wrote that in dressing the artist or the Christian propaganda,
Mhm.
the message being the most important thing. And if the message is the most important thing, then we don't care about how it's expressed. It's only important that we get the message out.
Right.
But if the way it's expressed is incorporated to that message, then we can say, well, let me back up a second. The way I see that we evaluate whether something is good is that the idea and the way it's expressed come together in this harmonious symphonic interplay.
Okay.
I think of it as two parts of a whole,
Mm-hmm.
the idea and the expression of the idea. When the idea is the most important thing, that's propaganda.
Right.
I'm old enough, I normally think of communist propaganda when I think of propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but Christian propaganda is just the same thing. And I see all propaganda is sterile. It has no life to it.
Fair
So
enough.
it has to be repeated over and over and over and over and over and over and over again until it gets parroted back. When the expression is the most important thing, that's just decoration. There's hardly any substance in it.
Mm-hmm.
Or in comedy terms, it's a one-liner. Yeah, we understand what it is. Now we can move on. We don't have to spend any time with it. But when the idea and the way it's expressed come together in this symphonic interplay, we go, oh, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's along the lines of what Francis Schaeffer is talking about.
Okay.
That it can be good by itself, where we express this idea, even if it's about God, in a way that, well, the Renaissance artists, they were looking for new ways or deeper ways to express these biblical themes.
Mm-hmm.
And, Michelangelo's ceiling, one that comes to mind as I mention it is, when God created Adam. That was a new way of depicting that idea. And we still use that idea today. It's presented all over the place. And we know what it's about. We know that that touch is almost about to happen when God the Father is about to touch Adam.
Mm-hmm.
But that idea had never been done before.
Yeah.
And it was so when we present these ideas and with this deeper way to express it, not just staying out of cliche. A lot of Christian art will have God as lion, thanks to C.S. Lewis,
Mm-hmm.
but also the metaphors that are in the Bible of God as a lion. So you'll see these cliches presented all the time. And if you go to Christian art websites, you'll see like half a dozen or so different themes presented over and over and over and over and over again
Mm-hmm.
that don't go past the surface to the depth of meaning that really should be expressed. And I think it's that depth of meaning is what Schaeffer is talking about.
Yeah. That is I like how you broke down the idea of the propaganda and then just the visual or expression of art. And if you take either one as itself, it falls short. It's like I said, propaganda has to be reminded over and over again, which for whatever reason, Animal Farm comes to my mind. Like, was it two legs bad, four legs good? And you just had to repeat it over and over ad nauseum. And then if you're just doing then for whatever, the declaration, I think of The Office, Michael Scott just stands up and yells, "I declare bankruptcy." It's like, all right, that's you just did your thing. But like you said, you bring them together, and there is that whole piece, and that's where in a lot of times people use the word balance. I like to use the word harmony because
Yeah.
there's an interplay between the two more than just an even amount of both.
Well, and that's where synergy comes from.
Mm-hmm.
The two parts have to come together in this harmonious symphony for synergy to happen. It won't happen if they're out of balance.
Yeah, I agree.
The way that I first began to think about this is from Proverbs 11:1, which says a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but just weights are his delight.
Yeah.
Which is a New American Standard. I like that word balance instead of scale.
Sure, yeah.
Because I think it gives this idea that it's not only a scale, but if you think of it in more of a term of a balance, even a pendulum, that pendulum happens to be in perfect balance only when it's straight down. Or a scale both sides have to be in equilibrium. If one has more weight than the other, then it's not going to be even. It'll just fall down.
Right.
So that's that verse is what first got me thinking along those lines of, and then when I incorporated that into a work itself, then it began to make more sense to me. And so this idea where the two parts become whole is only when they come together, not when they're off balance.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's probably a great place to kind of end this part of the conversation. Again, there's probably 100 different ways we could have gone through there, and I'm trying to restrain myself because there's already so many other ways I could even push that further on. But we'll save that for now. But again, thank you very much. I'm gonna, if you got a few more minutes, we'll run through some of these other questions. They're
Oh,
fun. I
sure.
think they also kind of can. It's interesting what tends to come up when we go through these questions. Again, these are rapid-ish fire. It doesn't have to be a one-word answer, but we're trying to keep it relatively on pace there. With the idea of charting life, I love explorers, exploration. So we're going to use that analogy for a little bit of this. So you were tasked with charting a previously unexplored island. You could bring 5 people with you, living or dead. They're real people, and I do rule out Jesus because it's way too easy just to pick Jesus for for
Oh,
Christians.
sure. Well, he
Um,
was a carpenter, so that would help.
that would. But the little caveats we have here is one person is going to help you survive, like the survivalist, and stay safe. The other person is going to be a storyteller of some sort for inspiration and telling your story. And then you got 3 other people of your choosing. Who's your crew?
Um, I guess Bear Gillis would be the first one because, you know, if he can't survive somewhere, then we're all in trouble.
Right, fair enough.
Um, an inspiration. I could do probably a couple of different ones. One would be my father-in-law. He was a Bible teacher,
Mhm.
Derek Prince, and so he would his stories were always interesting, both in teaching the Bible, but also his personal story.
Right.
Um, let's see. Others, I think it would be interesting to have a conversation with Oswald Chambers.
Yeah, that'd be an
That,
interesting for sure.
that his background was also in visual art.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I found that out when I read his biography, and he kind of gave that up
Hmm.
over time. But I think it would be interesting to really have some interesting conversations with him
Absolutely.
because of that. Um, who else? Hmm. Oh, I don't know who else.
All right.
Nothing's come to my mind.
That's all right. Yeah. Any other random people that you would bring with you, or family, or
Um, no, no one's coming to my mind at the moment.
no worries. All right, and keeping to the island theme, if you can bring one crop or plant to sustain life on the island, assuming the weather is temperate for that, what are you bringing?
Um, I think flax.
Oh, okay, that's a new one. I've not heard that yet.
Well, you know, flax isn't only a seed that you can make into bread,
Hmm.
but if I remember right, flax was also used in making linen.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know what I knew there was other. I can't remember what it was. I knew there was something else that could be made from it. So nice. I had one. I've had a couple of very interesting answers from those. So again, I think that was pretty fun. For the next year, if you focused on improving one, this is moving beyond the island, but focused on improving one area of your life over the next year, what would that be?
Um, hmm. I guess I've had an idea for another book, but it's going to take me years to
Sure.
research it.
Yeah.
And that's a book about beauty.
Beauty. Okay. Yeah. That is. Well, I'll be looking forward to that one whenever whenever that starts uh, coming around. Um, how do you decide which opportunities in life are worth pursuing? Because sometimes you can have competing opportunities come at you, but how do you decide which ones are worth pursuing?
Um, well, it seems to be what the Holy Spirit begins to emphasize.
Mhm.
Um, I can give you a quick example.
Sure.
After I graduated art school, I went on a tour of Asia with my dad. It was part of a missions trip.
Mhm.
And one of the countries we went to was Bhutan.
Okay, yeah.
And in Bhutan, we were taken on, we were part of this tour, went to different places. And the last thing of the tour was this handmade paper factory. And it was just a small, dark thing. Think of like maybe a 2-room hut, and that's about the size of it, with no electricity,
Mhm.
except in one room which was the showroom. And so in it, I was filling this paper, and I was going, "Oh, this is nice." The factory owner was right there, so I'm there for a few minutes, and my dad comes in. So I didn't know it at the time, but everyone had gone in and gone back on the bus except me. So dad was coming back to look for me.
Mhm.
And so he sees me going ooh and ah about this paper. And he says to me, who do I know that would like this paper? And I said, well, just about every artist I know. And he said, well, why don't you import it? I, oh, that's interesting. And I began to think out loud, say, well, if it costs this much and I'm able to get it to the United States and sell it for this much, then I could maybe make some money. So the factory owner is listening to me
Mhm.
do this. And so, unbeknownst to me, he goes to the government and gets me permission to do it. I
Wow.
haven't even done anything yet. Then we go back to, so it's the end of the tour, and we're having dinner with the owner of the tour company and his wife. And so my dad tells me, you need to tell them, about what just happened. So I tell him, about that, tell him kind of my thinking process about it, and they were getting excited. He said, you need to do this. So then we get back to the United States, and I still don't know if I'm going to do this. I just graduated art school, and but it seemed like this was what I needed to do. And so the deciding factor for me was that I would regret not taking the opportunity, even if it fails.
Mhm.
And so I began to import handmade paper from the country of Bhutan, and I sold it to artists and art stores around the country. And I
Wow.
had my business for 13 years. The So in Bhutan, it's a closed country to Christianity. In
Mhm.
fact, when we were there at the beginning, they were kicking missionaries out,
Mhm.
but they gave me open invitation to come in. So you don't ever know what's going to happen,
Right.
and so that really showed me that as long as you're willing to say yes, then adventure will be there.
Absolutely. I like that. I like that last line you had there too. But that's a really interesting story. Thank you for sharing that. What was the last time, or when was the last time you laughed so hard till it
Oh, probably something my wife said.
hurt? Is she the funnier one in the marriage, or are you, or you guys kind of both share it?
I think we both share it.
Nice.
She can be pretty quick witted when she wants.
Nice. My wife and I are a lot like that as well. One of those things we realize, like, life is stressful enough. There's way too many things that want to press in on you. So we're going to be, each other's encouragement, which is something you should be in a marriage. But we're also
Mhm.
going to bring levity into the situation as much as possible.
Sure.
And sometimes that quick, whether it is a laugh to a hurt situation or just a quick little laugh, is almost like just giving you enough to come up for air for a minute and
Yeah.
laugh. So I think that's I love humor, especially when it's done, you know, done right. Can you tell me about the last time you cried?
Um, there's different times when um, you hear stories about God's love that over time I've become more sensitive to those, and I will start crying when I start to hear those type of things.
Absolutely. Um, what does it mean to be good?
Well, if we go back to my definition,
Mm-hmm.
where the idea and the way it's expressed come together in this harmony, if you think about that more along the lines of how we are as human beings, the way
Mm-hmm.
we live life is our expression of what God has been teaching us. And so it's not only just having this head knowledge, but now we got to live it out.
Right.
And so the way it's expressed has to come together with that meaning in this harmonious symphonic interplay.
And so I guess what it would mean to be good is actually living within
Mm-hmm.
that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And then lastly, going back to the island imagery, if unfortunately things are going sideways and you could send out one final message to your family, your loved ones, after you know get past the "I love you, I'll miss you," that sort of important part, and you had just a really quick, maybe one paragraph to write down, what's the last advice you would give to them?
I guess be open to the opportunity God gives you.
That's good. That's good. I appreciate that. Again, this has been a very fantastic and interesting conversation, Rick. I definitely appreciate it. I'll give you a second if you want to go ahead and just let everyone know about your book or anything else that you're doing, so how people can reach out to you and be able to see what it is where they can be able to find anything, whether it's your art or your book or anything that you're doing. Um, give you a moment to share that.
Well, this is my book, um, Art the Church's Response. And we've touched on a few subjects in it. You can get it on Amazon's or Barnes & Noble, or ask your local store to get it for you. I'm kind of in the process of setting up more professional looking things like a page. Um, I have a Substack page that I write more about the nature of art, not necessarily from a Christian point of view,
Mm-hmm.
but an art point of view, incorporating all the arts into it. So if that's something that some people might like, then can share that as well.
Right. Absolutely. Yep. And we'll put all the details and the show notes or the comment, whichever format you're listening on, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever. I'll make sure the notes are available on that as well. Again, thank you very much for the conversation. And the part that I'm getting a little bit more confident in saying, although it's a weird thing for me, but like, subscribe, share this out. I'm sure that when you're listening to this, anyone's listening, there's somebody in your mind you're thinking of that like this is kind of like I know that artistic person, or I know that person who says they can't draw a straight line, therefore they can't be an artist, or whatever it is. Like there's somebody that has popped up in your mind at some point. Go ahead and share this with them, and then that'll be hopefully brighten their day and also be able to get the word out about this the show as well. So thank you. We'll see you in the next episode. Everybody have a great day. God bless.